Hello and welcome to episode 13 of Creative Walks. This is Pedro Bonatto. And before we get into the show, I just wanted to first do a couple of announcements. Yesterday, I talked about this project that I've been procrastinating about doing. But today, as I promised, the episode is out of the DNA of music. You can find it on YouTube, or if you prefer to listen, you can listen to it on my other podcast, the Wanderings podcast. And you can find all of this on my website, pedrobonatto.com. So with that out of the way, today I recorded a very cool interview for my podcast with one of my favorite photographers who happens to live here in Kyiv. His name is Dan Hatcho. He's a fantastic fine art nude photographer, and we recorded this conversation in one of my favorite studios in Kyiv, and it was right after he did a shoot. And I had a chance to talk to him about his process, and it was a fascinating conversation. It's coming out next week. The main thing I took out of this conversation is how many different ways there are to approaching your creation of art. Whether you're doing photographs or whatever else you're doing, there is sort of like, we have this idea that there is like one way or the correct way, or at least an optimal way of going about creating beautiful art. When it comes to doing photographs, for example, I always plan the image, I visualize it, I see the final result in my head ahead of time. So that usually means that I have to shape the light in the room to match my vision. And so I use a lot of strobes and flashes and all that. And then I like to try to emulate natural light. I like to use those flashes and the strobes to pretend it is, for example, the light of the sun coming out of the window, but it's actually a flash outside. He, however, Dan, does it completely differently. He actually prefers to shoot with natural light, which is like the available light of the sun. It could be on a cloudy day or very sunny, and he creates the shot he wants on the spot, but he does it inspired by the light and the location and the model. He doesn't have a plan ahead of time of what he wants to create. So that was very, very, very interesting to hear, because when you look at the work of other artists, especially the ones that have a technique or style or something that you really enjoy, you start trying to see your, let's say, method of doing art and how he would have done it if he was using your method. And in his lighting, for example, in his posing, it's always so perfect and painterly and on point. And I thought he was doing all this planning ahead of time, but he wasn't. He was letting his intuition and, of course, his deep knowledge of light. You can't pull that out of the hat if you don't know what light will do in different situations. So he doesn't try to fit a vision into a scene. He lets it emerge from what he has available. And that's something that I certainly would like to try to do more of. Whenever I try to improvise in a photo studio or on location, even if the photos that I come up with turn out nicer than the one that I had in my mind, I always see this as a failure, or at least like, damn, I couldn't get exactly what I wanted. When what you want is to create a beautiful artwork. And I'm not saying one is right and the other is wrong. It's just interesting to see how people that are in the same field can approach things in such a different way. I also had some time for myself in the studio before we actually started the interview. And as I was walking around the studio and looking at the lights and the environments, you can take a look at the studio on my Instagram at Pedro Bonatto. It's on my stories today. It will be until tomorrow, so you can have an idea of what I'm talking about. And that got me thinking about when you are in your element. And then That's, of course, completely different for different people. Like if you're a lawyer, it may be the courtroom. For a chef, it may be the kitchen. For a painter, it can be anywhere staring at that blank canvas. For a dancer, it can be on the stage or in a dance studio. So before I became a photographer and a musician, I had 3 or 4 beginnings of careers, including having a company and teaching and working in the government. And there were a lot of dead ends along the way until I found the stuff that I actually wanted to do. And I actually remember the exact moment, the first time that I felt in my element. That moment when you feel like, oh, wow, this is it. This is where I want to spend time. This is where I like to be. And to me, that was the first time I actually went on a photo studio to do actually my first fine art photograph. And it was so cool because I was alone in the studio, putting the lights together, waiting for the model, doing all that stuff. And I felt so at home. And I have felt that way ever since. Every time I go to the studio, I really enjoy it. I like the creative process. I like, even believe it or not, I like if there is like a disaster, I still like it. It's very interesting. And I also had this feeling in 2 other places, 2 other moments. One is, well, as I mentioned, I play Arabic drums. I'm a musician. And I remember the first time I did a show. I was taking classes for drumming, and it was just for fun. As I mentioned before, I didn't know where it was going to take me. And I remember my teacher, he asked me to fill in for him in one of the classes where the dancers are dancing and you go and you play for them. And I remember, of course, I was terrified. I was running late because he just called me and told me to go. When I got there and I started playing, I really, really, really felt like this joy of just being in the studio. And then I had it again on the first time because he saw I did a decent job. So he said, in his funny way, like, oh, you don't suck that much, so let's come back me up on a show. And it was like a small show. We had like 3 or 4 songs. But I remember like even like touching the floor of the place and thinking like, oh, I really enjoy this energy. Finally, I also had this moment, although this I never pursued as a career, of course, but I actually felt that way on a tennis court. It's one of those moments where your head gets clear and you feel that wind on your face and you're all sweaty. In my case, it was in Brazil, so we had a lot of clay courts. And you feel time stop. I thought it would be interesting to share this because sometimes we don't know what we want to do. It's one of those things that people that want to find the art or want to find a path, they are trying to figure out in different ways. And I think even when you start doing something that you like, it doesn't really click. You don't feel at ease or at home. You don't feel this, that you are in your element. So when you're trying to figure out where to go in your creative pursuits, one of the things that these thoughts today brought me to was for you to think of what places make you feel alive, what places make you feel like you're in your element, that they have this excitement of being there, but it's not, and you can even be nervous or even panicking sometimes, like if you're on stage on the first times, but you feel you belong there. So I thought it would be interesting to share this idea with you. And I'd love to hear what are the places that make you feel alive, that makes you be in your element. And if you haven't found it, it could be an interesting thing to pay attention, again, with this concept of pay attention to what has your attention and following your curiosity. At some point, you will end up in your own creative temple. So with that, that's it for today, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.